Welcome to Selling Secrets, the show about action movies and spy films. Our mission is to look at the movies we love and go behind the scenes to find out what makes a successful Hollywood blockbuster. From interviews to movie reviews, marketing campaign analysis, and more, Selling Secrets is your home of spy films and action movies. Do you know what it takes to make a Hollywood blockbuster successful? Let's find out together on Selling Secrets. Hello and welcome to Selling Secrets. I'm your host, Josh Gay. Joining me today is a man who has been a lifelong James Bond fan since the early 1960s when he saw Thunderball in cinemas as a young kid. My guest in today's episode is Bill Koenig. Bill is the creator of the Spy Command blog and podcast, and he's also one of the co-hosts of the James Bond and Friends podcast. Professionally, Bill is a journalist and reporter who has covered the James Bond franchise, as well as the automotive industry and cinema in general for many, many years. I had a fantastic time talking with Bill for today's episode, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. So, without further ado, here's my interview with Bill Koenig from the Spy Command. Hello and welcome to Selling Secrets. I'm your host, Josh Gay. Joining me today is a very special guest. It's Bill Koenig. Bill is the host and creator of the Spy Command blog and podcast. Bill, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Josh. I appreciate it very much.
It's an absolute honor. I was saying to you before we started recording, I've been following everything you've done for many years, and even when it was the HMSS blog back in the day, and listening to the James Bond and Friends podcast. So it's a real honor to have you on, and someone who is such a wealth of knowledge in the spy genre.
Well, thank you. I'm honored that you put it that way. I'm humbled, actually, but let's do this.
Fantastic. Well, for those who may not know who you are and haven't necessarily followed what you do, can you tell us who you are and what you do?
I am a longtime fan of the spy genre. I actually I began following Bond in the mid '60s with Thunderball, and specifically. There was this television special in the States called The Incredible World of James Bond. And it came along at a time when there were like a lot of spy shows in the US and in England too. But for me, it was just my eyes opened up because my father had actually read some of the Bond novels by Ian Fleming, but when I saw that special, it's like, whoa, and I finally, so that came on in November of '65. And then I saw Thunderball sometime in the spring of '66. I don't know the precise date because when you're that young, the specific details aren't that clear, but it was, in the fall of '65, there were like a lot of spy TV shows in the US and in the UK as well. But like I thought that, and I've gone back and looked it over, but like Thunderball gave people something they could not get on TV, with the jetpack and the underwater fights and all this other stuff. And it's just like it became a lifetime obsession with me. So obviously it was a big change in my life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, for me, I think my first cinema experience with Bond was Die Another Day. So, I mean, another movie that you definitely wouldn't have had a TV experience with Die Another Day back in the early 2000s, but for different reasons, I think.
Well, just so you know, so like Die Another Day came out, I was well into adulthood.
Mm.
And so I was working, I'm still living in the Detroit area. So like Ford Motor Company had a big product placement deal with Die Another Day.
Mm.
It had to do with Jaguar. It had to do with their European luxury brands. So like reporters who are covering the automotive industry were invited to see an advanced showing of Die Another Day, like 2 or 3 days before it came out in theaters. And so I got invited to that. And yeah, it was a huge deal.
Oh yeah.
And yeah. So I know what you're talking about. And Die Another Day is kind of, has kind of a mixed reaction among fans today for a variety of reasons. But at the time, it was a huge deal. It was because Ford had a history earlier with the Bond series, going back to Goldfinger and Thunderball. And then like decades later, here they are with Die Another Day, and they've got, Aston Martin, because they owned Aston Martin by that time, and Jaguar and Volvo and other cars. So that's why Ford organized this thing, where people got invited and I attended, and it was a big deal. And it was like the 40th anniversary. It was just So anyway, just however you feel about Die Another Day, it was a big milestone in the history of the Bond series. So, and I was there.
It was also the highest grossing Bond film ever at its time as well. So commercially, it was a success. Yeah. Whether it was critically acclaimed compared to its predecessors, we won't get into that. But
right. Well, and in the pre-credit sequence, there were like a ton of cars that like Ford, the brands Ford controlled, because what was his name? The villain, had all these cars, and you saw them.
Moon at the start, yeah.
So that it was definitely like you knew that going in. At least I did as a reporter covering the automotive industry. Like I recognized all the vehicles.
Oh, that's phenomenal. And speaking of your background as a reporter in the automotive industry, there's a real synergy there between yourself and I. I've worked previously, before getting into advertising, I was in the automotive industry when I was retraining in marketing, and now predominantly at the agency I work for, it's all of my clients are automotive. So can you tell us a little bit about your time working as a reporter, both in the auto sphere and in general?
Well, I started being a reporter in 1980, because I graduated from college in 1980. And I became a professional journalist in 1980. And by 1985, I was covering the auto industry pretty intensively. And, ever since that time, I can never view a movie exactly the way audiences are supposed to see it, because I say, oh, that's a Ford movie. Oh, that's a GM movie. Oh, that's a BMW movie. It's just you recognize, like for example, The Living Daylights in '87. That was primarily an Audi movie. Yes, there was an Aston Martin, but there were like all these Audi models as well. So like when I watch a movie or a TV show these days, like I can't help myself. I realize what's going on. So with Die Another Day specifically, Ford had been out of it for a couple of decades, but then they came back in. Because BMW had done the first couple of Brosnan movies, but then Ford cut the deal, and but it wasn't just Ford. It was the luxury brands that they controlled at the time. So Ford owned Aston Martin, they owned Volvo cars, and they whatever. Anyway. Yeah, I just can't help myself just watching it that way. That just affects the way you watch the movie. It's one of those things. There's a saying, once seen can't be unseen. That's how I am with cars.
Tell me about it. I mean, I was watching the Uncharted movie recently at the premiere here in Melbourne, the new movie with Tom Holland and Mark Wahlberg, and
Even though it's based off a video game, which was highly successful and it would have made money anyway, every single car in that film was a Hyundai brand car. So other than one car, which was like a luxury, I think it was a Ferrari that the villain drove, every other car was either a Genesis or some sort of Hyundai. And you can't help but notice those things when you've worked in the industry for so long.
Yeah, and I remember in 2002, I interviewed. The guy had once been the head of American Motors, which American Motors was eventually acquired by Chrysler and now is part of Stellantis, whatever it's called now.
Such a bizarre name.
I know it is. It absolutely is. But I remember talking to him about the whole business about Bond product placement, and he said, because he was the CEO of American Motors when they did the deal with the man with the golden gun. He said, "Oh yeah, it's great. It made sense." I said, "So what do you think about?" There had been reports with that Ford had supposedly spent $35 million on its deal for Die Another Day, and he said, "Well, I don't know about that," because at that point he had been out of the industry. He was on the faculty of the University of Michigan, but yeah, he said, "Well, I'm not sure I could justify that, but but I had also interviewed he was the president. He was not the number one guy. He was like the number two guy." He said, and he was English, by the way. His name was Nick Shayla, and he said, "Oh, I could justify that. It's fine." And obviously they did the deal. And then Ford also then extended it to Quantum of Solace. It wasn't quite as extensive as Die Another Day, but Ford has not been involved with the Bond series since then. So,
well, considering they sold all of the brands off, Jaguar now being with is it Tata Motors in
Tata? Yes, of India. Yeah, Tata. Because Tata acquired both Land Rover and I can't remember.
Jaguar,
yeah.
Yeah, that whole brand was taken over, which is interesting, though, that they've still kept that relationship with the Bond franchise after Ford have left and Aston Martin have become an independent brand as well. It's interesting that Tata continued that on regardless.
Exactly. And those brands still have an English identity. So I can understand that, and I can understand why Eon would be interested in continuing it, but it's just it is weird just how things change as corporate events change. So
absolutely. Would you like to see, speaking cars in general, any of the brands that have previously been in the Bond franchise come back, whether it be your General Motors brands, your Fords, or even Lotus, for instance? We've been saturated with Astons over the past couple of Daniel Craig films. Is there anything else you'd like to see come?
It would depend on the story. If they did a Bond movie set in the States, or with like at least part of it set in the States, it would make sense for like Ford to have a presence. GM has not had a lot of. GM was involved with Live and Let Die. And somebody pointed out to me, and I had not noticed this till he said this, like all in Live and Let Die, like almost all of the cars are Chevrolet cars, and they're almost all the same models. And it's like, once it was pointed out to me, it's like, boy, that's true. I had kind of passed. I had sort of like not noticed that, but then like, whoa, it's like, yeah, it is true, because in some stills you can see, if you look closely, it's like the stunt drivers are all wearing helmets, and it's like, well, I never really noticed that till it was pointed out to me, but. Yeah,
well, I guess face replacement technology for stunt people wasn't really a thing back in the early 70s, right?
not in 72, 73, not at all. So like now you could like get away with a lot more, but
definitely. Well, look, we've been speaking Bond, but your blog and podcast doesn't just cover James Bond. You're a big fan of the spy genre in general. What is it about spy films that have captured your passion and your imagination for so many years?
I have to admit, what really got it into me, and this even predates my interest in Bond, was The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which has an Ian Fleming connection, as it turns out, which I didn't realize when I was a kid. There was just something about it was just cool. It seemed modern at the time, and it just, there was like an element of danger and so forth. So like I said, Uncle got me into the spy genre to begin with. Uncle got me into Bond, and then Bond got me into Harry Palmer, got me into here in the States in 1965, the fall of 65, you had Uncle came on in the fall of 64, but in 65 you had I Spy, which was a more realistic, or at least semi more realistic thing, which you had a white man and a black man as equal partners. That was a very socially significant show at the time. And then in 66 you had Mission Impossible, the original show. And and also you had in 65 the Wild Wild West, which was spies and cowboys. And so you got into a lot of it was like catching lightning in a bottle. And I've said this multiple times, but it's true. It really was this piece of magic. And it was and each of these things had their own mystique. And, I've seen some writers, say, well, Uncle's just a Bond knockoff, or the Wild Wild West is just a not Bond knockoff. Not really. They all had their specific, they just were just magic in their own way, and it was just really a special time, and it kind of defined my childhood, I guess. Yeah, it was just great. And when I see attempts to kind of bring these things back, it's like, oh, maybe they shouldn't try to bring them back. I don't know, because because in the late 90s there was this attempt to bring back the Wild Wild West with Will Smith, and it's just like, didn't work out.
Same with the Avengers as well in the late 90s with Ray Fiennes.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly. Oh yes, because we were talking just before we were recording, and when I saw Majesty's, like, in my house we watched the Avengers because an American TV network started importing the Avengers, and like Diana Rigg I thought was like fantastic. And so like when I'm watching when I watched Majesty's the first time, it's like, well, they got a new Bond and he's not necessarily the greatest guy, but like, okay, but they got Diana Rigg. And then when she gets killed, like, what? Just, I was devastated. And like, and my mother had taken me to see Majesty's in the theater, and we got back. My dad had read the book, and like, well, so what do you think about it? Because he had read the book. He knew what was going on. And it's like, wow. And I just, like I said, I was devastated. He said, well, son, that's how it goes. You can't always get what you want.
Oh, that's amazing. And to have that experience as well. I mean, the only time I've experienced a new Bond is with Daniel Craig coming on and taking over from Brosnan, obviously in the early 2000s, which was very much like a hard reset. I mean, you've obviously experienced the change from Connery to Moore, to Lazenby, to Dalton. Can you speak to a little bit about sort of how the Bond franchise has evolved over the past 60 years? We're coming into the 60th anniversary now. And how have they changed with the times and stayed relevant over the 6 decades?
Well, like I remember like I said, I had seen Lazenby in Majesties, and again, I got it. Like, okay, they have a new Bond, so okay, fine. I want James Bond movies, so like I can deal with that. But then Lazenby is just one time, and then suddenly Connery's back, and like Connery was just like Connery's return was just this big deal, and I know that these days a lot of Bond fans aren't really keen on diamonds, and I understand why. And if you look back, if you take it sort of like a super analytical look, like they were probably like spending so much on Connery's salary, they probably didn't have that much of a budget to deal with the other stuff. Because because I have a copy of it was like Tom Mankiewicz's first draft. He had taken over from Richard Maybaum. So his first draft had a much more elaborate ending, but they probably couldn't afford it. So it's like, we'll just like, don't worry about that. Because United Artists, Diamonds was the first time United Artists really leaned on Broccoli and Saltzman to change their plans, because they originally wanted to have American actor named John Gavin be Bond, and then like the UA execs said, no, we're not going to do this. We want Connery back, and so Connery got this big salary. Yes, he donated to a trust he had founded, but still, it was just, things were a lot different. And I remember thinking after Diamonds came out, I thought, this is the end. There are not going to be any more James Bond movies. And then a friend said, no, there's going to be this other movie. They said he's going to be back in Live and Let Die. And so there was a TV special on American TV with Paul McCartney, and part of it said, Paul McCartney says, yeah, I'm going to be doing the music for the new James Bond movie. Well, that was a little bit of an exaggeration, but yeah, he was doing the title song with his wife. And, on this TV special, there were like a lot of clips and such. Like, whoa, like, and then later I tracked down a copy of Time magazine here in the US, and they had like 2 pages of text and 2 pages of text and a page or 2 of photos. Like, yeah, this is happening. Like, whoa, like I was wrong. I'm going to have to check this out. So that was part of it. And also, I was aware that, the Bond series in the films was going in a lighter direction, but like, I was still happy. It's like, there's going to be James Bond movies in the future. I'm right there. And I know some of my contemporaries say things like, oh, I was done. This is not what I signed up for. Well, like, I was happy for it. Now, did I agree with everything? No, but well, I will tell you, when The Spy Who Loved Me came out in the summer of '77, like, whoa, this is back. This is back in a big way. So, like I said, some of my contemporaries really didn't like the Roger Moore films, but I was there. It's like I could deal with it, and I was happy. I wanted Bond films to continue, so they did.
I love the pivot from Diamonds to Live and Let Die, especially because whilst Roger is, I guess, looked at as the lighter Bond, I'd argue that Diamonds was almost a spoof parody in comparison to the tone of Live and Let Die, which is remarkably darker in terms of the film itself.
I think the main pivot point isn't Connery to Roger. It's Tom Mankiewicz getting involved. He had a much more of a humorous take. I know there's like two movies have both Maybaum and Mankiewicz in the writing credit, but I think Maybaum and Mankiewicz didn't really see eye to eye. I don't think they even really worked that much together, because I know with Diamonds, like Maybaum started it and Mankiewicz came in later. And then with Live and Let Die, it's like one of the few times Mankiewicz was there all the way from the start to the very end. That's a very rare thing with movies in general. And it's especially rare with Bond movies. So, yeah. So with The Man with the Golden Gun, it's another Maybaum Mankiewicz credit, but it's just a lot different. And then with The Spy Who Loved Me, there were like something like 12 writers or something like
Huge.
that. It's really hard to kind of figure out who did what, because of course only Maybaum and Christopher Wood got a credit, but there were like all these other guys who like contributed to the final script. So again, it's really hard to dissect all this stuff, but the 70s was definitely overall a big pivot point. But I was still there because I know, again, specifically, I saw this interview with Raymond Benson online, and he said, like, he gave up in the 70s because he said, this is not what I signed on for. It might have been an interview with David Zaritsky. I forget who it was specifically, but I do remember hearing him say that. But like, I stuck it out, and like, I wanted James Bond movies, and we got them. And it's like, you can see the different directions, you could see the different takes, but I was there.
Absolutely. And I think that's a testament to the longevity of it, is that people will come back to the franchise no matter what they think of it. And you look at, say, the contemporary Bond films with the Daniel Craig era, and there's many people who adore the Craig films, Casino, Skyfall, are considered some of the best Bond films in the entire 25 series run. But then he's also got people who don't like him at all, and there's people who say that Bond ended with Pierce Brosnan and Craig Blonde Not Bond and all that garbage. But especially with No Time to Die, that really, I mean, I guess that was more the direction of the film than Craig himself. But people will still come back, I think, regardless of the direction that the franchise takes.
You know what? I agree with you, and also I've been known to pick at Quantum of Solace myself on some of my blog posts, but I've said this multiple times. It's like with Quantum of Solace, like some of the photography, I think is fantastic. It's like beautiful. Specifically, I've said this on more than one occasion. Like there's that sequence right after the main titles with that horse racing sequence, with intercut with the interrogation. Like a lot of that it's beautifully shot. It's just my problem with Quantum has to do with, I think the story kind of got put off to the whatever. It just wasn't. I don't think the story got thought out that well, because like all of a sudden, like at the end of Casino, Mathis was getting interrogated. Then suddenly, like in Quantum's like, oh, he's got it. MI6 got him a big house with a live-in girlfriend. Like, well, how did that happen? But,
in the space of how many weeks?
Yeah, exactly. And they said that, it's like it just happened 2 weeks after the Casino. Like, well, I don't think so. But I feel like, I guess, like to me that's like a bridge too far. But I know there are like a lot of Quantum fans, and like I don't want to make fun of them. And it's like, if you like the things you like in Quantum, you go for it. But to me, I think they didn't, I don't think they thought it out that well, but
So I'm a bit of a Quantum defender in the sense of that I much prefer it over Spectre. I still think it is one of the weaker films. It relies heavily on knowing what happened in Casino. It's
right.
a product of the writers' strike. It's a product of trying to be Jason Bourne and really mirror the gritty 2010 mid 2000s, I should say, action films. But in saying that, it does feel fresh and it does feel energetic, whether that's just to do with the pace of the film being so short. But I compare that to Spectre, and Spectre, I fall asleep in that film.
I get where you're coming from. I get where you're coming from. Trust me. Yeah, it's again, I don't want to get too much, picking because, I mean, there are like a lot of little things, and to be honest, if it hadn't been for that writer's strike, and so something else had to do with how, excuse me, it had to do with how, again, it's supposed to be like 2 weeks or 2 days, whatever because they were kind of inconsistent about the time lapse between Casino and Quantum, but but after a while, I can't keep arguing the point. Like I put out my objections, and okay, there you go. I'm just not going to do it anymore.
Along with it.
Yeah.
Well, look, speaking about Bond and the longevity of the franchise and having run for 60 years, and we touched on this previously with other franchises, what do you think it is about Bond that has kept it so relevant and fresh and allowed it to go on for 6 decades versus franchises, say, like The Avengers, who, was basically the TV show, then a reboot, which was unsuccessful? What is it about Bond that has kept it going so well?
I think Bond has this, he is just this amazing character, and he can be tweaked, but he's very adaptable. He can be adapted to different eras. And, again, I'm a big James Bond fan. Some people send me texts I'm criticizing Bond. No, I can get into details, but Bond he's a classic character, and he can, he can and has adapted to different eras, and it's remarkable. I think it's absolutely remarkable, and that's my best answer.
I agree. Well, speaking of those other films, say, ones that have maybe come back for a reboot, like The Man from U.N.C.L.E. or The Avengers, as we said before, what is it about those films that, compared to Bond, didn't work and maybe didn't capture the imaginations of audiences of, be it the 20th century, 21st century? What do you think it is about those that, didn't work?
Well, specifically with The Man from U.N.C.L.E., just to be clear, that 2015 movie gave me personally enough U.N.C.L.E. that I could like it, but I don't think the makers looked at it as closely as they should have, because the original U.N.C.L.E. in the 60s had much more of a science fiction thing, especially when it came to the MacGuffin, what the villains and the heroes were chasing after. So on the original TV show, they had one of the MacGuffins was a machine that could reverse aging. Another MacGuffin had to do with a serum that could quickly heal you. And that movie, that 2015 movie, ignored all that. And the 2015 Uncle movie could have been a lot worse because at least we had two characters who were like roughly the same age, because I am acquainted with somebody who worked on the movie, and at one point they were looking at like an old Solo and a young Ilya. Like, no, don't go there. And they didn't go there. But was it perfect? No. But, and then I mentioned briefly before we talked about the Wild Wild West, and, you had Will Smith and Kevin Kline, and that I went to see it in the theater. What is that? Yeah, exactly. It just no. And again, the Wild Wild West, the original TV show was, it had fantasy, it had science fiction involved for something set in the 1870s, which is particularly amazing. But like, no, they didn't get that. And maybe at this point, I've kind of like concluded, like, maybe it was just the 60s just couldn't really be repeated, and it's really hard to repeat it. And that makes me sad in a way, but yeah, it just, and there's other, I could say other examples, but I think that's part of it. It was just a magic time, and maybe it wasn't meant to be repeated. I don't know.
I agree with you on that. And I've got a friend, Hugh, who's a very young kid. He's still in high school, but follows me on social media, and we talk quite a bit. And he's a massive fan of the Jerry Anderson series.
Yes.
All the Joe 90 and all those sort of the Thunderbirds. And you sort of look at the modern interpretations of those, be it the mid 2000s film or the animated series, and they just don't quite capture that essence of the original 60s 70s source material.
Yeah, and just so you know, like, I saw some of the Jerry Anderson things in the 60s. The one I remember specifically was Stingray, because it was set in I think 2065, 100 years after when it was made. And they had this this submarine, and they had World Aquanautic Security Patrol, I think it was. But I loved those Jerry Anderson shows. I mostly remember Stingray, and I remember Thunderbirds, and that's just really hard to read. That's hard to. Excuse me. That's just hard to. That's just hard to do. It's just, again, it's like lightning in a bottle. You catch it, and again, the 1960s were just a magic time, for, not only for spies, but also the science fiction stuff. And it's really hard to do, and maybe it's not meant to be recaptured. I don't know, but
I think so. And I think, especially when it comes to the spy genre, you're talking about the height of the Cold War, where political tensions with Russia were very, very tense, and there was a lot of real world connection to the spy stories, whether they had a bit of sci-fi flair to them or whatever it was. There was a certain element of this could be happening right now, whereas you look at maybe, I'd say, the Daniel Craig films, for instance, or the 2015 Man from U.N.C.L.E. film, where it relies heavily on nostalgia for that period. They don't necessarily feel as relevant, because up until 2022, when Russia has decided to kick off another Cold War.
I know. I know. All of a sudden it seems relevant, but
it hasn't been relevant, right?
But with U.N.C.L.E. specifically, it's like they had done in the original TV show, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., they had to be really careful, because it's 1965. They don't want to go too far, but they did do some hints at the Cold War, but they didn't want to say it explicitly. So there was this one episode in the first season where David McCallum has this, he's wearing this disguise, And his disguise, which I didn't know for decades later, he's like disguising himself to look like a young Trotsky. he's got a black wig and wire rimmed glasses and a mustache, and it's like he's disguising himself to look like Trotsky. And there's like another episode again in the first season where Solo and Ilya are going to this rich person's place in Long Island in New York. And Ilya says something like, "Suddenly I feel very Russian." And then Solo says to Ilya, says, "Well, if I don't get out of here in an hour, feel free to start a revolution." Now that's subtle, but it's not that subtle. But anyway, but you had to be careful like that.
Absolutely. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, so that's kind of how things were. You had to be careful, and so it was
the same time, there was a real world villain as such that you could look to with Russians. Was in the Bond franchise with Smersh or whatever it was. These days we almost have to create our villains unless we're going down the realistic route with the Taliban or Middle Eastern terrorists or whatever it is. There hasn't been up until recently that sort of spy versus spy genre like we used to have as well.
And in Die Another Day, like one of the main criticisms of the movie is like, what is Safin after? It was just kind of vague what his thing was.
Oh, in No Time to Die, sorry.
Yeah. Because there were these ships coming and they were apparently some of Safin's customers. It was all kind of vague.
He's a doctor, which only a henchman says once. And are we supposed to believe that he's Dr. No? Or,
Right.
Is he a mega? I was watching Calvin Dyson's mega 2-hour review of the film recently, and he was talking. He's not a fan of Safin at all. He made that quite clear.
I watched that also, and I it's a very good dissection of that whole movie. And it's like, I mean, my hat's off to Calvin for taking that much time.
Oh, absolutely.
to analyzing it. But I agree with him because, like, I initially gave No Time to Die an A-, but like, I'm tempted to kind of reevaluate, but like, I don't want to do it too soon, so I'm kind of stepping back. But because in my case, I had been like seriously spoiled about, and not just like a couple weeks before it came out. I was spoiled like a year before it came out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's like, and I didn't believe it initially, and then like, it became pretty clear before it came out. Oh crap, this is how it's going to come out. So when I was evaluating the movie, okay, do I feel emotional with the end? Yeah, I do feel emotional with the end, but at the same time, I can't really evaluate it. Should they have killed him off? Well, clearly Calvin believes no, and I know a lot of Bond fans believe no. And so, like, I don't know. I'm going to have to take another look at this, and at some point, but I'm not ready to do it right now.
I personally, I think the death of Bond, I don't mind with. I'm okay with them killing Bond. I think that's okay. It's, as Calvin said, it didn't feel earned. And I know David likes his Bonds to be a bit more heroic, David Zaritsky, in terms of like, if he was going to kill himself, should it be more, heroic and sacrificial, where he's more like, say, at the end of The Dark Knight Rises, where he's, flying out over the ocean to save Gotham from the nuclear bomb. Whereas in this one, it almost feels like the villain won. Bond's just dead.
Well, also, Robert Downey Jr. in Avengers Endgame is like, so when I first saw No Time to Die, Bond's death reminded me of Tony Stark's death in Avengers Endgame. And also there are other examples of where a hero gets killed, but he gets killed in a way that is heroic And so I said, oh, just killing off Bond doesn't upset me, but again, as Calvin said, was it earned? Boy, I don't know. I keep going back to it, and I probably need to like reappraise it.
I think I need to see the film another 10 times before I can make a final judgment on it.
And I'm the same way. Like I saw it 2 times in the theater. I saw it 2 times on viewing on demand. I paid $20 to watch it, and I watched it as many times as I could for my $20. And it's like I haven't seen it since. Like maybe I need to go back again and reevaluate. But but I do know there are some Bond fans really, really hate it. And
vehemently hate it. Yes, I know quite a few of them.
And I'm not ready to go that far, but
no. Likewise, the film as a whole, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think there's just a couple of story beats and character beats that definitely let it down from being a perfect film, and I think that's probably a product of script rewrites, directorial changes, whether it be studio interference, whatever it is. So, just a couple of things. Maybe we start a petition like with Justice League. We release the Fukunaga cut.
maybe
that'd be good. Well, speaking the death of Bond and the franchise as a whole, very much so you could look at it as the franchise is coming to an end, but it isn't. At the end of the film, James Bond will return. We've got Amazon sort of coming in to take over MGM in the next year or so. Obviously that deal hasn't been finalized yet, so that's all up in the air a little bit. But for the future of James Bond, what would you like to see? What direction would you like to see the franchise take?
I would like to see a somewhat lighter, and I do not mean any Roger Moore sense lighter, but like a little bit less somber tone. It's just we've had 15 years of like really, really heavy stuff. It just would be nice to have just just a little bit lighter, just a little bit more humor. But like, again, I'm not talking about, double taking pigeons. I'm not talking about anything like that, but just a little bit, not quite so heavy. And also I don't really need like another 5-part interconnected thing. No, I mean, if you go back and look like at the early Bond films, like the first 2 or 3, they're like a little bit of references to previous films. Like in From Russia with Love, Kronstein says, as an added refinement, I think Spectre can get a revenge on James Bond because the man MI6 will almost certainly send their agent James Bond, and he killed Dr. No. And like that's not an exact quote, obviously, but like there were like little tiny continuity references, but you don't need this really heavy thing. And like in Goldfinger, Bond says something to Felix about, he makes some comment, I forgot off the top of my head, but he makes some comment about how, obviously they had encountered each other with Dr. No. It's like, you don't need to go heavy with continuity, just little tiny things. That's all you need. And if you look at the original Fleming novels, there's like a little tiny references, like Goldfinger, the Goldfinger novel. Oh, I'm sorry, not Goldfinger novel. It was like, no, it's Goldfinger novel. Mentioned, Mr. DuPont had played at the Baccarat table in Casino Royale. Little things like that. That's all you need. You don't need to go this heavy thing. Yes, I know Marvel people want to do stuff with Marvel, but Marvel works because Marvel's essentially copying Marvel comic books from decades ago. Like,
you've got 30 odd characters to bring
together.
Yeah.
So just lighten up a bit. I don't really need to know. I just don't need another somber James Bond after 15 years of Daniel Craig. Just stop it.
Fun. I think fun would be the best word. Almost to the Pierce Brosnan sort of tone is where I'd like them to go back, where it's just fun. We're going there for an adventure. It's not trying to say anything or win awards. It's just there to be entertainment.
Yeah, the Brosnan films, since you mentioned them, I thought they had a really nice balance between the two extremes. And yeah, that's, something like that. I think that's what they want to do. I don't know if that's what Barbara Broccoli wants to do, because I think she wants to go heavy dramatic. Or at least so far, that's what she has demonstrated. But we'll see. But since you asked me, that's what I would like.
Definitely.
Which guarantees that won't happen.
But look, I think if they were to, I like what you're saying about having, just little connective tissue rather than, being an overarching thing. But if they were to do an overarching thing, actually plan it out, have some sort of, whether it be a trilogy or whatever it is, where you've got a beginning, middle, and end planned out, almost a little bit like what Nolan did with the Dark Knight trilogy, where there's an actual story between each of the films that carries over and affects the characters, rather than it having to go back and retcon different things. I think that's the only way I personally would want it to be a continuation or extended universe or whatever the hell you want to call it.
Right, and I just want to make sure I mention, okay, I'm a Marvel fan because I grew up on Marvel comic books. So what those movies have attempted to do is kind of interconnect their movies, and that's fine. And because at least there's a roadmap. But with Bond, don't do this where you're doing it after the fact, because specifically in 2011, before they were going to film Skyfall, Sam Mendes at the press conference said, "Oh yeah, those past two movies have nothing to do with this movie." And you know what? The way they filmed it, no, they didn't. But then after the fact, then it's Silva really Spectre guy. No, he wasn't.
Spectre just completely retconned Silva's entire backstory and made him a pawn of Blofeld, and you just go, really?
And also at some point, Broccoli and Wilson did an interview. I would have to dig up the specific source of it, where they said, "Oh yeah, Quantum is much better than Spectre. Quantum is modern and all this stuff." And then they got the rights to Spectre back. Oh, forget that. But but again, they act like we as fans are supposed to forget they ever said this. Well, okay, some fans may want to forget it, but I can't forget it because I remember reading this, and I'm taking you at your word.
The internet exists.
They exist, yes. These things can be checked.
It's like our politicians saying, "I never said that," and you go back and you look at a video of them saying the exact thing that they're denying saying.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, I really appreciate you coming on the show and taking the time to speak with me today about all things Bond and spy films and the spy genre. Before we close out our discussion for today, a question I always like to ask people who come on the show is, are there any other creators in on the social media landscape or online who you would recommend people check out and follow their content?
Well, I think we mentioned Calvin Dyson. He does these great videos. David Zariski does these great videos. Joe Darlington used to do videos. I don't know if he's still doing them, but he helped me out. He did when I started doing audio versions of my Spy Command post, he created he created a logo for and there's a lot of there's a lot of Bond fans out there. If I'm overlooking any, I'm sorry, but there's a ton of great Bond creators, and they're all worth your time.
Absolutely. And where can we find you online if people follow what you do and the content that you create?
Well, the Spy Command can be found online at hmssweblog.wordpress.com. I also have a website called The Man from Uncle Episode Guide, which is at Uncle Episode Guide, all one word, .wordpress.com. And I have some other websites, but the Uncle site was my very first foray onto the internet, but those are the main ones.
And I'll make sure to link those in the show notes of this episode as well. And I'd also like to mention, your podcast, The Spy Command, and James Bond and Friends as well. They're both fantastic and well worth a listen to as well. Love the discussions that you guys have on the James Bond and Friends podcast.
You know what? The James Bond and Friends have been a fantastic source of enjoyment for me over like 2 or 3 years now. So, the thing with James Bond and Friends, there are so many potential guests, like we can't all get on at the same time. but that's fine. That's great.
That's the magic of it.
That is the magic of it. And so, anytime I can get on that podcast, it's great. So,
absolutely. Well, Bill, thank you very much for coming on again to Selling Secrets. This has been my interview with Bill Koenig from the Spy Command. I'm your host, Josh Gay, and thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Josh.
So that was my interview with Bill Koenig from the Spy Command. Thanks again to Bill for coming on to Selling Secrets. I had an absolute blast talking all things James Bond and the spy genre with him. If you'd like to check out more of what Bill does, you can find links to the Spy Command blog in the show notes of this podcast. And if you'd like to follow us, Selling Secrets, online, you can find us on Instagram at Selling Secrets Pod and on Facebook, Selling Secrets Podcast. And if you'd like to follow me, your host, Josh Gay, you can find me on Instagram at 007Oz, which is at 007 AUS. And if you've been enjoying Selling Secrets, please leave us a review on whatever podcast platform that you listen to us on. Your feedback means the world to me, and your reviews do help this podcast grow. Until next time, thank you again for listening to Selling Secrets. I've been your host, Josh Gay. See you soon.